Sounds, bringing lost audio to light. I'm Herman Beavers, professor of English and Africana Studies, and I'm your host and moderator. It's my pleasure to introduce our two wonderful and brilliant guests. Ken Druker, to my right, has been professionally involved in jazz for over 30 years as a record executive, educator, presenter, and radio host. He's a producer of two recent John Coltrane releases, Both Directions at Once, the Lost Album, which came out in 2018, and A Love Supreme Live in Seattle 2021. He's currently Senior Vice President for Jazz Development at the Verve Label Group, where he oversees a vast catalog that includes the historic Verve, Impulse, Mercury, Decca, Commodore, and Argo Cadet labels. I would like to just have 1 hour in that archive and try and make out of there with everything I can get in my hands. To my left is Chris Mustazza, who's co-director of the PennSound Archive, the world's largest archive of poetry recordings, and he teaches here in the English department at Penn. His research focuses on literary audio and sound studies. Chris is a former student of mine, and so he's an equally brilliant critic of poetry. His book manuscripts, Speech Labs, Collecting Poets' Voices in the Period of Early Sound Recordings, is on its way to, is in production, I take it, or it's still making the rounds?
Yeah, hopefully soon.
It's the first history of how poets came to be recorded during the infancy of recorded sound. So if you've ever heard one of those unfortunate recordings by T.S. Eliot, where he sounds like he's in the midst of dying from dysentery, Chris would know about that.
Those are the recordings I'm going to play tonight.
And so we're going to talk about a lot of stuff, but we're going to talk about bringing lost audio to light. This is particularly important because lost audio is a way for people who are marginalized and silenced in the larger society to be brought into the foreground sonically. And so it proved this is going to be a very interesting discussion. And so with that, I will turn it over to Chris and Ken.
Thank you so much, Herman. Thank you. And I have to say that a lot of the material that I'm going to be talking about for my presentation, I developed in Herman's class, and so I had the opportunity to have a really rigorous environment with Herman and the rest of our students to talk about these. And so this has been a long-standing project for me, so it's exciting to talk to all of you about it today. So I just wanted to kind of frame out the event a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ken to talk about the Coltrane tapes, which I'm really excited to hear about. So this event really comes from the idea that Penn is one of the leading places for what we call literary audio, right? We run the PennSound Archive, what we were talking about before. And at least with literary audio, this is not a thing with music, I think, so much, but like people don't oftentimes ask questions about the recordings, such as, where did these recordings come from? Like, what is the provenance of these? Who made these recordings? For whom? Like, what media were these recordings made on? Why did they make it on this particular media? Who could consume that media? So lots of questions about this that I think are vitally important as sound moves through time. Ken and I were talking about this earlier today, where when we think about sound recordings and archives and record distribution, we're stewards of this content, right? Like we hold it for a very brief period of time. It's come to us, it's been mediated, it's been remediated, and someday it will be mediated again into media we can't even fathom right now, right? When they can get that quarter-inch guitar jack and it just goes into your skull, you know, like whatever technology. It'll be wireless. I'm being ridiculous. It'll be wireless. But you get the idea. So the idea behind Found Sounds is to think about not just finding audio, not just taking things that were lost or maybe unrecognized or underappreciated, but the deep how do we make these things accessible, and what decisions do we make, and how do we kind of attach context to these recordings as they move through time. So that's just a little bit of the background for it, and I'll turn it over to Ken.
I'll talk about the first album that Herman mentioned, Both Directions at Once, the Lost Album. And you were saying about how these things come to be or how we find them, and there's a lot of elements that are really amazing about this story. There are many John Coltrane recordings that were recorded live, and there are a lot of bootlegs that people find, and the performances are always strong, the quality's not always great. This was a very rare situation where we had a studio recording and essentially an album's worth of music that no one ever knew about. Recorded at a very famous, maybe one of the most famous studios in all of jazz, Rudy Van Gelder Studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. And it was recorded March 6, 1963. And there's a very famous recording made the very next day, John Coltrane and Johnny Hartman. And no one knew this existed. How did we come to find it? For most people went in and recorded at Rudy Van Gelder Studio. They left. Rudy kept the tape. He mixed it. If it was stereo, he mastered it, and he would cut it on his lathe for making an LP. Only very few artists had the privilege of taking home what was called a reference tape. So John Coltrane was one of the few artists for whom Rudy would run another tape machine on a 1/4-inch tape, and at the end of the session would give it to Coltrane to take home. That happened very, very infrequently. In this case, Coltrane took it home, and the tape, he wanted to listen to it, see if there was good stuff on it for a record. In this case, it was left at the house of his ex-wife, Naima, for those of you who know the song title, Naima, that was her house. And after Naima passed away, many, many tapes were found in her home, most of them being these reference tapes that John had brought home from Rudy Van Gelder's. This was a session, a great jazz scholar went through all the tapes. A lot of them were things that had already been released as albums. There was only one full session that no one knew about, and it was this March 6, 1963 session. And we had to start, so we knew the music existed. We had to find out what happened. Why was this never released? Given the amount of recording, essentially John Coltrane at this time had carte blanche to record, which was another unusual thing for a jazz musician to be able to just go into a studio whenever he wanted. The band had been playing at a famous jazz club for 2 weeks. This was the last night of the 2-week gig. I guess he liked what he heard playing, the band playing, and he wanted to go into the studio the afternoon before the last night of the gig. It's material. 2 of the songs are completely new compositions. They may have been things he was playing at Birdland that week. We'll never know. And if you look at the, not on this one, but if you look at the titles, we left each title in the studio, even if there's a name or not, they're given a take number, 11383, 11386. We just kept those numbers for the compositions that didn't have names that we didn't know up till now. They're called Untitled Composition or Untitled Tune 11383. And what happened at a certain point is all the tapes were at Rudy Van Gelder's. Impulse Records, for who John Coltrane recorded at the time, was sold. And this happens a lot in the record business where companies purchase other companies. In this case, they wanted to save storage space. They went to Rudy Van Gelder's. They took all the master tapes. The ones that had been used for commercial releases were kept, and the ones that hadn't been used for commercial releases were thrown away, which is a shocking thing, but not, Chris and I were talking before, not completely unheard of. So that this reference tape that John Coltrane took home in March of 1963 was the only record of this recording. And very good quality, recorded by Rudy Van Gelder. So to have this studio quality recording is really an odd thing. And what it allows us to do, there are two kinds of tapes from a recording session that we can usually will find. One is just a master. So all the work has been done. It's the final songs used to make the LP or the CD, and it's just the final versions of the tunes. There are also session tapes, which is where you hear everyone talking between takes, where you hear if the band starts and then they stop and then they start again and they don't like it and they rework it, and you can hear some conversation. That's what we had here with this reference tape, which is something we have almost none of John Coltrane on Impulse. Even in general, there's not really a lot. He was a very quiet man anyways, but you don't hear the engineer on. There are not many session tapes of John Coltrane. So what I brought to play is something that we don't get to hear very much of, is how a song develops in studio. There was no rehearsal for this session, but they'd been playing in a club for 2 weeks. I don't know whether or not they were playing this song, but I just wanted to take you through very quickly how something can develop. And it's interesting. This is a very famous, one of the most famous groups in jazz, the John Coltrane Quartet of the early 1960s, with McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums. So to hear how they work things out and how, to a certain extent, John Coltrane's thinking about the music is really interesting. This is a song called Villia, which in itself is a very odd choice. It's a Franz Lehar composition from an operetta called The Merry Widow. It was a swing band hit when Coltrane would have been a young man. Artie Shaw recorded it, but it's not something he ever recorded. It's not a popular jazz song at all. So this is, I guess let's listen to, we can let 1, 2, and 3 run through.
Sure.
So this is the very beginning of the session. They just turn on the tape and this is what happens.
I was listening, oh wait, actually I did. For those listening on the stream, we're actually going to mute the audio on the stream. Sorry about this, but if YouTube picks up any copyrighted stuff, they will shut down our stream, and then you won't be able to hang out for the rest. So we're gonna mute the stream. We're gonna play this, and then we'll bring you back in 1 minute.
So what we heard there is John Coltrane playing tenor saxophone. Something didn't feel right on the first 2 takes, whether it was the drums, something wasn't comfortable. And on that 3rd take, they play it all the way through, and that's a full take. But then something, they got the 1 take down, and then something tells Coltrane he played a number of instruments, but mostly tenor saxophone and soprano saxophone. He said, and this is, there are not a lot of things on record where he plays the same song on both instruments. But here he says, let me pick up the soprano saxophone and hear what it sounds like. And then we get to take 4. Full take. So this is in a very limited way, but because it's so rare, getting to hear even that little bit of how a song develops at a Coltrane recording session is really exciting. It was, when we first heard it, it was very exciting, and continues to be, just to see how his mind was working, how the group interacted, and you in this room are really the only ones to hear the not full takes. Tracks 1, 2, and 4 were not put on the commercial release of this album because I didn't think anyone wanted to hear 11 seconds of a song over and over and over. But that was a big takeaway from when we heard this, something we don't normally get to hear, and what's very exciting about finding a new source and new music.
You should totally release those on the record. I mean, one of my favorite records is like the Making of the Beach Boys or something, and it's just like you hear like the drums going, and then Dennis Wilson's like, "No, do it again. I don't like it." I just listen to that. I never listened to Fun, Fun, Fun. I only listened to the messing up the drums. That was great. Thanks so much, Ken. We were talking about this earlier. It's just about like how these pieces see new life. With PennSound, here, this is. I'm just going to show you a couple braggy slides about PennSound. Forgive me. So PennSound was founded by Charles Bernstein and Al Filreis in 2003, and we've got recordings going back to 1913, all the way through stuff being recorded in the current month. And here's my braggy slide: seeing 2.5 million downloads per year, and 6,000 hours of audio. It's the world's largest archive of poetry recordings. But one of the interesting things about PennSound for today to talk about is the fact that it's what I would call in many ways a meta-archive, which is while we do produce some of our own content, every poetry recording that happens here in the Arts Cafe finds its way into PennSound. We also acquire older archives, which are basically the same thing that we are doing now. People had poured that same love and care into the curation of their archives and the production of their archives. And for whatever reason, they find their way to us, and we archive the archives, right? So we have the Harvard Vicarium recording, stuff from the Library of Congress. This is a reel-to-reel of Robert Creeley reading. His son brought us just this box of reel-to-reel tapes from Creeley's attic and said, "Do you guys want these?" And we said, "Yes, absolutely." So we took those. And all manner of things comes to us. And in fact, for my part, one of my favorite things to do is to go to archives and look for old recordings of poetry that other people don't value as much or don't know what they have, and who will let us put it up on PennSound to make freely available to the world in this way. And so that is, I want to tell you about the main project I've been working on, which is the Speech Lab recordings. This actually came to me through like a kind of a weird, interaction. So I was hanging out with Al one day, and Al asks me, where do you think the earliest recordings of William Carlos Williams came from 1942? And I was like, I don't know. And Al said, beats me. And he just walked away. But I thought about it all day. I was like, where did those recordings come from? And so, anyway, long story, slightly less long, I ended up finding out that Columbia University may have had some early poetry recordings there. So I wrote to Columbia, and I asked them, do you guys know anything about this William Carlos Williams record? I'm just trying to find out about it. And they said, we got this box of old records. We got a bibliography. Let us know if you care about this. And they sent it to me, and it was T.S. Eliot, Gertrude Stein, the earliest recordings of Robert Frost. Like just this who's who of modernist poets. And so Al and I were like on the train the next day up there, and we're like, can we have this? And I said, okay. So it was actually kind of an interesting project of digitization and contextualization. And I'll tell you a little bit about the series today. So this was recorded. This is the most interesting thing, though I'm not going to focus on this today, but we could talk about it in the Q&A if you guys are interested. But it was actually recorded in a dialect lab. For those of you who've ever been to a dialect lab in a linguistics department or something like this, where they phoneticians bring people in and they ask them to read specially curated sentences and things because they want to measure the vowel sounds. They want to look at regional accent and accent that ties to different identities and things like this. That was the kind of lab that recorded T.S. Eliot and Robert Frost, and it's a very strange context. And so my book is really about why, and it turned out that it was actually not weird or a one-off, but like all of the earliest poetry recordings in different places in France and Germany and at Harvard, they were being recorded in these phonetics labs. So I was very interested in that. And one of the things with this particular recording, and because this is a session on audio, I'll just nerd out about the particulars of audio here, is they were recorded on these aluminum records, which before this I had never seen before. I actually brought one for you guys. If you guys want to come and check it out after, whatever, this is one of them. It's like this indestructible record where it's called a transcription disc. And because of it's pretty much just a footnote in audio recording history for a number of reasons. One is that there was a brief ish period of time as these things go where people lost the ability to record sound. So in the beginning of recorded sound, there were these. Again, you can check this out later. This is a wax cylinder. This is the first form of commercially viable sound recording. And if you had one of these, you've probably seen pictures of people in front of like a horn, and like listening to the phonograph and so forth. You could actually get a cutting needle for this. So you could get a blank wax cylinder, and you could make your own recordings. Or you could buy, records, and you could play them. So you had the ability to read and write. When the disc format, which is all of you guys are familiar with, like the vinyl records and so forth, when that became dominant, people really lost that ability to make their own content. And it was record companies who would put out records and you could consume, but you couldn't make records until magnetic tape comes around, right? The 1940s and 50s, and it restores that. So in that like interstitial period, these weird aluminum transcription discs, you could see it's marketed to people, make your own recordings. This would be like, record your kids playing piano or something like that on these, whatever you want. Your own bad poetry recitations. You don't need Eliot's bad recitation. You can make your own bad recitation, right? And so you could see like the pictures and how this is framed. And these were actually developed initially by ad agencies to record ads off the radio as one-time recordings to play it back for their clients to be like, look how great we made Coca-Cola sound, whatever, like on the radio. And so that's kind of the framing of it. But they're terrible quality, really bad. I mean, basically you have a piece of metal with another piece of metal cutting into it in real time. So you picture you're reading the poem, and this thing is carving, it's engraving, and it's happening as it goes. So not like not like cutting wax, which was done, in other studios. And with wax, it's forgiving, it's soft, and so it doesn't have this kind of sound. I'm gonna play you my favorite poem from the archive. I think I don't know if you guys have your tissue box handy. You might get emotional with this. I apologize in advance. I'm just gonna play it for you though. Record, right? I've listened to many hours of this. I find deep meaning in it. But you can see that like all of these recordings are sort of like inscribed with this sound, and it's and I always talk about this as like the sound of amateur recording of the time. Like this is like lo-fi before there was lo-fi. This is lo-fi before there was fi, right? Like this was. And then here's my favorite part. What do you think you play a metal record with? Can't play it with the metal needle, right? Because you'd have sparks flying everywhere, screeching and stuff like that. So what do you play this thing with? Turns out you play it with, you guessed it, cactus needles. So, and what is the most ridiculous research purchase anybody has ever made? Cactus needles. So these are actually, I'll show them if you guys want to come around after, you can check them out. But these are actually needles from the 1930s, cactus needles. That is what these records were played with. And it turned out that these didn't last super long. Turns out cactus gunks up your needles, and when the invention of plastic changed things and so forth. But this is how amateur this kind of equipment was, and this was being used to make these massively important recordings in these labs. Another note on why you may have never heard of aluminum transcription discs, if you haven't, is because, and this is what Ken and I were talking about earlier, many of them were destroyed in the scrap metal drives of World War II. I'm really interested in when you're a content provider, when you're a record label, when you're doing something like PennSound, what is your onus to preserve something, even in the commercial sphere? Like if you're making something, this thing is of a cultural import, right? And it could be sold now, it could be timely now, but like what is your onus to preserve this into the future? And the early record labels weren't really doing that as much, not the kind of care that Ken is putting into his products, where he's actually thinking about what are the minute aesthetic decisions, how will this work, how can I respect the content, how can it flow into the future? But at this time, the metal masters and these aluminum transcription discs were donated to scrap metal drives where they were melted down and turned into airplane fuselage and things like this. So, so many of them were totally erased from the record. It just so happens that these recordings survived because they were housed at Columbia University, and Columbia protected them. So I was always very interested in this, like in this idea of the records are on one hand this amateur rogue project, right? Like the linguists are not like paid to record the poets. Like they're not like, their research is not being graded on whether you've recorded poets or anything like that. They do it as a sort of like labor of love. oppositionally to other people who would not record the poets. They felt like this was important to be remembered. But on the other hand, it ends up being the professional memory institution, Columbia's library, that is the reason that this stuff survives. So while its creation is oppositional, the professionalization allows it to go on. So I was always really interested in that contradiction. So the recordings I'll tell you just a little bit about today, just quickly, are, as Herman alluded to, the T.S. Eliot recordings, which are, I'm so excited that we're just releasing these now in PennSound for the first time. For the 100th anniversary of The Wasteland, which is this year. I spent the summer working with Emma on these recordings. She knows more about these recordings than I do. I've listened to them a lot, but she's listened to them more than I have. And you know, I give you this picture. Whenever I think of The Wasteland, this is what I think of, this document over here. If you guys have ever seen this before, it's the original manuscript of The Wasteland, where Eliot wrote it and he sends it to Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound just takes a red pen to it. He just like the whole thing. I'll tell you what, the first thing he does is strike the title. I'll tell you that 1 second. He just writes no next to it, you know. And so picture The Wasteland, like 50 some pages of this, of just Pound taking his pen to it and so forth. And so we're releasing the recordings, and you see here, this is the first page of The Wasteland. You see Il Miglior Fabbro, right? This is for the better craftsman for Ezra Pound, after this comes out. And so the original title of The Wasteland is He Do the Police in Different Voices. Strange title. It's a line from a Dickens character that Dickens character spoke. But it really does, while it's a weird title, it opens up a lot about the poem that you lose in the title The Wasteland, which is that this is a poem about voices. This is a poem about what you would call heteroglossia, right? Different people speaking. And the reason this poem really vexed so many people is because you never know who's talking at any given time, certainly not in the text of the poem. And people hated that. They wanted a poem with an I of the poem, right? I went out into the world, I did this, I was changed forever. You know, like, but this is not that. This is something else. And in Eliot's performance of it, he starts to embody the different voices in the poem in a way that you can never pick up if you're just reading it. So I'll play you the beginning. This is a section that I agree here. This part is a little bit dry, but this is a section that everybody knows. So I'll play this for you.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain.
So if you know any lines from The Wasteland, you probably know April is the cruelest month, right? But as the poem opens up, and I actually think that section sets the rest in relief, Eliot starts doing this kind of drama where he's playing all of the parts in the poem. There was a weird word for this in the 19th century called a monopolylogue, which is one person doing many voices. It basically was like a platform show where somebody would come out and it would be a play, but instead of many people coming out, one person would just do all the voices. And so Eliot does that here. You can't quite pick this up in here. So I'll play you this scene from a game of chess, and just to set the scene for you, this is somebody who's ostensibly sitting maybe alone, maybe not, in a kind of rundown or very ornate mansion of a place. Picture like a cold room with maybe like gold fixtures and things like this. This is the kind of space we're in right now.
My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you are thinking. Think. I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But oh, that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down. So, what shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do?
So you see he's moving between the personas, and who is he talking to? Is there another person in the room? Is this an internal monologue? Is he speaking to, is it like a voice in his head? And then all of a sudden you get this the Shakespearean rag was like a popular song of the time. It was like it was a fragment of like a ragtime song. And you could think about this in the contemporary moment. Do you guys know TikTok? Yes, you know this. Do you think? I don't know. I don't have it. But like they play like these like there's like little songs and stuff, or picture a fragment of a pop song getting stuck in your head when you're walking around. And this poem's about fragments. It's about like you hear this voice and you think about this fragment, and then you think about this other voice, and you hear it all kind of coming together into this piece here through the sound, through the recording, in a way that you cannot get from the text alone. And again, don't take my word for it. Emma has written more extensively about this than I have. And I think that it's an example of what these recordings can do when they come to light, and they can refactor our understandings of things. So it's not like a new thing that just stands on its own, but it revises everything that comes before it when they come out. So just as a final note, so what do we do with all this stuff? PennSound itself is not the point. It's like the infrastructure to support other things. So in my classes and many classes here at Penn, these recordings are used for undergraduate education. Whenever I go to give a talk literally anywhere, I have high school teachers and professors at different universities saying that they use PennSound in their classes. It interfaces with Jacket 2 magazine, which is our Jacket 2 is like a Pitchfork, but better, and for poetry. And, it's a magazine of poetry criticism. Here today at the Kelly Writers House, we've played these Al Filreis' ModPo course that sees tens of thousands of students totally free, able to access these materials. Our podcasts like Poem Talk. So for me, this is sort of the payoff of all of this work, is finding the work, contextualizing it, pinning that context to it so you know where this came from and why it matters, and distributing it so people can use it. So.
Okay, so do you want to go to Q&A?
Yeah, should we open it up for questions?
So let's open it up for questions. I certainly have a question or two, but let's turn to the audience first. If you have questions, please don't be bashful. Yes.
I was wondering if you got some recordings of some of the early people here at Penn, like Eckert and Maudsley, who invented the first all-electronic computer, or maybe, Buckminster Fuller or something like that, if you got them talking in a class.
Oh, that's a great question. We at PennSound we focus on poetry recordings, so we haven't looked at like pen history, but that would be a really great project for somebody to work on. One of my colleagues was just telling me the other day that he really wishes that there were recordings of the early sociologists like C. Wright Mills and other people who are in that space. So I'm interested in it, but I haven't worked on it myself.
Okay.
I don't know, Ken, have you seen anything kind of in that space of like early vocal recordings come your way at all?
Not that I can think of. I'm also focused on on jazz stuff, but no, I can't think of anything.
This was all so interesting. Thank you so much to both of you. But I was wondering about like with modern audio engineering and like audio editing softwares, how does that affect or how does that help like any type of, especially when you get audio from things like aluminum discs or from other sources that like have a lot of issues, like how does modern technology help to make them viable enough for the archive or for commercial release?
You wanna take that?
Sure. A lot of tapes that we find are in, it's mostly, well, some of them, the tapes themselves have deteriorated. But in most cases, if the tapes are playable, they weren't recorded under the best circumstances. They may have been recorded by someone sitting in a jazz club, hiding a giant recorder in their jacket with a microphone coming out of their shirt so no one sees them recording. Or they were live recordings. We released recently a Ella Fitzgerald live at the Hollywood Bowl, which was it was a great recording and an amazing performance, but it wasn't recorded to be commercially released. It was an archival recording, and in this it was a full orchestra. It was a full jazz big band plus string section. Ella's voice was a little far back. Some of the instruments, there were a few solos, a trumpet solo that couldn't really be heard. And in that case, we can use technology to create, in this case, our engineer created a sort of stereo. It was a mono recording. He created a kind of fake stereo sound. There's a new technology called isotope, that allows you to do that. And in separating the voices into channels, he was able to bring Ella's voice up and bring some of the instruments up. You can't do a lot, and if you do too much, it's not a good listen. But in terms of cleaning up things that are tape loss, the technology is there, but always more important than the technology are the ears of the engineer doing the work. That's the most important thing. So if you have a good engineer who has access to good tools, you can do a lot of things.
And I would add a couple of things onto that. For one, I think this is a kind of contentious point. I'm interested in your thought on this, Ken. But I was at a talk one time, and I was talking about the importance of noise in recordings, and I enraged somebody by this, who had been doing really kind of high level like audio filtering work to remove the noise, basically make an old recording sound like it was recorded yesterday. And I was saying that's not what I do. I like the noise. I think the noise historicizes it. I actually think it's not over the content. It's inextricable from the content, and those two things are necessary. So I think just I won't resolve that tension. I'll just say that I think that's the thing you could think about, is to what degree is restoration a good thing or not when you're thinking about these things. The second thing, and this is actually something I learned in Herman's class. We read this article. And this has stuck with me for the entire time, however many years it's been now, about Motown Records in the 1960s started mixing for audio tape. And so at the very level of the mix, it was saying make it sound good on audio tape, right? So audio tape sucks, right? Why? What is the one thing that audio tape is good for? It's portable. Right, so who would need a portable tape in the 1960s? More affluent people with cars, right? So so Motown is now broadcasting basically this is who our audience is. You can take that into the current moment; it still exists. So one of the things that a lot of producers today find very fraught is some people will mix for AirPods, right? And they'll say, well, why would you mix for AirPods? You need to make it sound good in a full speaker system. And I say, well, that's not how people listen to it, And so this is kind of the thing where Dr. Dre would burn, even though he had a full studio, he would burn a disc and play it in a minivan going around the block because that's where it has to sound good. So just to say, some of that is a matter of practicality of where make it sound good where people listen, but the other thing has a politics to it of you're saying who your audience is at the very moment that you make the mix. So.
Other questions? Okay, we got a question in the back.
Sorry, I have to zoom in on myself because I'm the camera person.
I'm not kidding.
Okay, sort of. It's still working. Okay. Do I look good? Okay. So I'm a sophomore here at Penn and also an English major. And I took one of the first classes I took here was this class called Sound! With Javier something. It was a really cool class. And I thought about that class a lot and kind of convinced myself that, if I didn't want to be a writer, I would have been an ethnomusicologist or something because it's just so cool to me. So first of all, I'm probably going to take your class.
Oh,
that sounds
please.
cool.
Advanced registration is open. Spring, poetry, music, sounds of the 20th century.
Okay. Thank you for that. But then I was also wondering, I guess maybe about PennSound and archiving in general, because you were talking about when the John Coltrane album debuted, you left, or I don't know who left out, but the takes with where it's only 7 seconds long because it would get annoying. And so my question is, in terms of archiving generally, how did you go about making selections? Because I know PennSound is just massive, but is it submission based? Whatever you and your team are interested in. If somebody was hey, can you archive this YouTube video I made when I was 15? Would you take it? Or because I mean, that was a big thing we talked about in my sound class. Is sound is a source of a source of power. It's who is heard, who is not heard. That's why I was interested about that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question, and it really animates a lot of what I was doing with this project because I wanted to know, I always think of this function from math called the principle of inclusion and exclusion. It's something from statistics. It doesn't matter what it's actually about. I would always think about that idea of like, what is the principle of inclusion and exclusion of this archive? And I write extensively about that with the Speech Lab recordings. With PennSound, it's not submission based, it's curated, and it kind of follows a certain kind of aesthetic lineage where these recordings are more, different people call it different things. Some people would say formally experimental. Some people would say different things. But there is a principle of curation, and I think that's an important thing to note when you're listening to anything. The closest, maybe Ken, you have thoughts on this as well. Like I was going to say, the closest thing I could think of as an example would be like, certain small indie record labels are looking for certain sounds and certain kinds of bands, and that's who they sign and that's who they play. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Ken.
Well, in terms of especially this Coltrane record, a concern of mine that probably is not a concern of PennSound is the commercial aspect. I have to go out and sell this record and make sure people want to hear it. And so on this, given what's happened to music listening, there are a lot more choices than there used to be. So that we did a standard version, which was a single LP and a single CD. And I don't know if we did a single CD, but we did a single LP that included one version of every song that was recorded, just like the album may have come out in 1963 if they had released it. But on the tape we found, there were many takes. There was a song called Impressions that I think there were 4 or 5 full takes of. And some of the songs have 2 takes. So we did a deluxe edition, which was 2 LPs, where we put all those full takes. And really the only thing that was left off of it were these false starts, as we call them, of Vilia. Because I worked with John Coltrane's son, Ravi Coltrane. We co-produced this album. And so it was back and forth about what to include, what not to include. And I think as a commercial product, if you were listening to the LP, listening to those 11-second and 13-second false starts would get annoying. They could be interesting. We could have put them on a digital version of the album. We may do that at some point. But really, those are the only things that are missing. So we do have this consideration about what makes a good listen commercially and just as a listening experience for the fan.
Other questions? So I have a question. So, you always hear the term production values. And I guess the question that I have is, what sort of production values informed bringing out this lost record? We sometimes talk about them in terms of high and low production values, but let's set that aside a second and just talk about production values.
Well, with the Both Directions at Once, we were very fortunate in that it was a studio session, and the tape miraculously was in great shape 55 years after it had been recorded. But you mentioned another project I worked on later called A Love Supreme Live in Seattle. And that's an album that came out last year. John Coltrane's most famous composition and probably his most famous album is called A Love Supreme. At first, for a long time, it was believed he never performed. It's a 4-movement suite. For a long time, it was believed he never performed the entire suite. We found in the early 2000s, we found a live performance from France that was released. But then more recently, we found this recording from a club in Seattle where the entire suite was performed by an expanded group and really was very different than the studio recording. The recording quality was not great. It was recorded in a club with, we think, a couple of microphones hanging over the stage. One of the microphones hanging over the drummer, Elvin Jones, who, if you listen to music, is a very loud and powerful drummer. So we had, in the quality of the recording was not pristine. And we had a big discussion. The performance is incredibly strong. Historically, it's very interesting. But are people going to want to listen to this? And what we decided, again, the ears of the engineer, we went back to the original tape, found there are many different tape heads that you can use to transfer music from a tape. And our engineer found exactly the right tape head to get the most information off the tape possible. And we had what was then a much better recording than we thought we had based on the very first transfer we had done. And then you can go in and it's not really noise reduction, but just taking out some things that aren't part of the music at all, make it a better listen. And then we still had to decide, is the performance strong enough to have people listen to a suboptimal recording? And ultimately we decided, yes, it was. And then your ears get used to it. As you listen to it, at first you go, oh, Elvin's really loud. But then you get used to it and your ears acclimate and you can appreciate the performance. So, but that is a very big concern, whether or not to even release something based on the quality.
Thanks for that. And then for you, Chris, thinking about Eliot doing these different voices, I'm thinking about Michael North's book on race and modernism. And I'm thinking about, North starts the book by talking about Eliot and Pound writing to one another in these black dialects. Does that get into the recording? In other words, are there black voices that are making it onto the recording that aren't identified as such,
That's a good question.
but which Eliot is definitely hearing as?
That's a great question. So I'll say in the recording of The Wasteland, not that I've heard, but like one of the poems where is in Sweeney Agonistes, where he starts performing Under the Bamboo Tree, the James Weldon Johnson song, which is fraught as we know, as we've talked about. So I think that African American voices are always very present for Eliot. I haven't heard them in these recordings, but in this recording, he does a whole suite of like English Cockney accents and voices, whereas he's trying to embody the working class in England at the time, and it comes off definitely as a sort of like fetishization as happening in the moment. The part of the poem is it's conceptually very powerful, but it leaves you feeling very uncomfortable at the end.
Also, this is just because I haven't looked. Does PennSound have Hart Crane?
We don't have Hart Crane, no.
Because he's the other poet that I think of as somebody that writes sort of polyvocally in his work, especially in the bridge. So it'd be interesting to discover some recordings by him. But other questions, please don't be bashful. Yes, sir. Wait for the mic.
I hope this makes sense. It strikes me that poetry and jazz have very different relationships to like the original text and live performance. Poetry being more focused on the page and like the original text kind of, where jazz is much more, in the moment, spontaneous about the live performance. And I'm kind of hoping that maybe you'll speak to each other a little bit about if, seeing poetry's, if you learned anything about, live performance and recording from poetry, and if you in turn have learned anything about recording and the text from jazz.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. Do you-
I can talk about the Louis Armstrong piece, but also, we've been listening to instrumental music, but when it comes to vocal music, and you have a lyric, it is closer to poetry. And when especially this Ella Fitzgerald recording I mentioned, when we think of Ella's live recordings, there's usually a lot of scat singing, but in this particular case, there's almost none because she's singing the Irving Berlin songbook, which the arrangements are for big band. She recorded in the studio, and this concert was just her singing the songs as she recorded them in the studio. So it's more about the text. So it's very interesting from that point of view. It's not Ella scatting and doing what she's most known for. It is a strict reading of the lyric in an arrangement, in a fairly hemmed in arrangement. There's no room for her to improvise. So it's not exactly poetry, but it does, the conversation changes when you talk about vocal music. But I was telling Chris, and it turns out you can hear it now, we discovered a recording of Louis Armstrong at his home not long before his death. He had a reel-to-reel tape machine that he loved talking to and keeping the tapes and making these beautiful collages on the covers. He recorded, for some reason, in February of 1971, he recorded the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas. 'Twas the night before Christmas. He recorded that twice. We don't know why. You can hear all of his recordings on the Louis Armstrong House Museum website, by the way. They've digitized and everything's up there. So there are a lot of Christmas songs that Armstrong recorded. We wanted to make a Christmas record. There's never been a Christmas record by Louis Armstrong, but I wanted something new. So we took this recording of him reading Visit from St. Nicholas, but I thought it needed a little something. And so we worked with a young New Orleans pianist named Sullivan Fortner, who listened to the poem, to listen to Armstrong's reading of the poem. And we went into the studio, and he improvised a piano accompaniment to Armstrong's reading. So even though the words were not being improvised, Sullivan is a wonderful pianist, and in about 5 takes, we could hear him he listened to it, he played, and it would change each time. And I think on the 4th or 5th take, he was happy and we were happy. And so we have this mix of improvisation and poetry that, as I checked just before this, you can actually listen to on the streaming services now. It was a wonderful project and speaks to this kind of relationship.
Yeah, and I think that it's a great question because poetry, as you say, like the idea of there being an original in poetry and scripture, as it were, is very historically dependent, right? Like the printing press did a lot of harm to poetry in certain ways, in that for the majority of the thousands of years of poetry, it was a performed art, right? Go back to the Homeric rhapsodes and so forth. And we've only, in this kind of moment after the printing press, come to think of it as a read art. And in fact, when you look at PennSound, you'll find many different versions of the same poem performed by the same poet. One of the things that I'm interested in is those variations. I oftentimes think of a poem as a constellation, right? Which is all of the performed versions and all of the written, edited versions. And in that constellation is the metaphysical poem, like as it were. But you can't point to a thing and say like this thing is the poem. And I think jazz, that's one of the things that underwrites it. We were talking about this a little bit before in the sense that I was interested in ads for early sound recording where they would say it's just like being there. And so they would bring people to like a show and the curtains would be closed and there would be music playing. Everybody's like, oh, the band is playing. And they would roll the curtains back and it was just a phonograph playing, right? And it was, see, it's just like being here. If you buy this for your house, you don't even have to go to the show anymore, right? And then now in the current moment, all of that inverts where somebody says, I went to this show. This band is so good live. They sound just like the record, right? So now like the record becomes a thing. So I'm always kind of interested in that idea of like how do you bring back the fluidity and like liveness of things that always have been but have become to be perceived as frozen. I think that's some overlap.
Well, it's interesting because I was telling a group of students after they read Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which is this play by August Wilson about this recording session in Chicago. And I was saying that one of the things about recordings is that it really is about that person that day under those conditions, whether they might be hungry, whether they might be thirsty, whether they might be tired, whether there's all of this stuff that comes into the recording as these variables. And, what's interesting about recording is that inevitably, particularly with jazz, is this music that is about, my metaphor for it is you build this elaborate house live and then you tear it down and build another house the next night. And so hearing somebody on a recording, one of the things about pop music is that, particularly pop music in the 60s, is that you can hear a recording of a record and there'll be a guitar solo or another kind of piano solo, and they'll play it exactly the same way on Ed Sullivan that night, and people never really pick up on the fact that musicians, rock musicians, pop musicians are as interested in improvisation as jazz musicians are, but the genre of the music really is sort of mitigates people understanding that. So, Springsteen probably has jam sessions all the time where he riffs on what's going on on the Born to Run recording, nobody ever hears it. So what about that? Because the thing is, it means that what we get is really the tip of the iceberg when it comes to music.
You get a real snapshot of that day. Jazz musicians do not want to repeat themselves. They don't want to be, lip syncing on Ed Sullivan.
Right.
The famous saxophonist Lester Young said, "You don't want to be a repeater pencil." And there have been jazz hits where people expect the solos, because if they're used to pop and they really haven't listened to jazz, they expect the solos to be the same as they were on the record. But those musicians would have to go back and learn their own solos from the record,
Right.
which they were not willing to do.
Right.
So it's foundational in jazz that you don't repeat yourself, and a solo is your personal expression. So it's there have been instances when Duke Ellington had big hits and there were famous bits of solo there that they wanted repeated on Take the A Train, things like that, that it does cause a problem between fans and the musicians who don't want to be, especially that generation of musicians who don't want to be repeating themselves endlessly.
Well, the great thing about CDs that include outtakes is that you really do come to understand that jazz is this ephemeral music. But at the same time, what's so interesting about the Coltrane record is that it'd be really interesting to know, if you could bring the voices forward, what is causing him to stop playing and start over again. Because in each instance, I thought the record was going to keep going. The sound is good. What's going on with the band is good. I can hear McCoy Tyner doing really interesting things on the piano, and it just stops.
And that quartet in particular was so much of an organism that I don't know that we'll ever know. Something just felt off. They'd been probably playing it in the club for a couple of weeks, but no. Well, I don't know. Maybe someone could listen. There's another outtake where you can hear the time gets turned around, the rhythm gets turned around, and there it's obvious. But that's after about a minute or so. On these, I really have no idea. There was something that didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? I love talking about records. I still have vinyl. Other questions? Yes. He'll wait for the mic.
I guess I have two questions for Ken, if you'll indulge me. You kind of touched on it before about, what you select for recording and what's commercial, but I saw an interview this week with the new head of Impulse, who I'm sure you saw this interview and I'm sure you work with him. And he teased that there's some more Coltrane stuff coming, and he kind of talked about shepherding his legacy. And there's like more stuff in the vaults than people might realize, but the copyright holders or the record companies have kind of blocked some of that stuff from being released to preserve his legacy. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, like sort of, he's such an important historical figure. I think someone mentioned when you get new recordings from someone whose work you know so well, it's like, discovering a new chapter of the Bible or whatever, it's a very rich text. But some of that you're keeping back from being heard publicly because, he probably didn't want that released. It's, bad material subjectively. And maybe you could talk about with this material, like why he didn't release it and why you chose to release it. Obviously, you worked with the family. But if you could just sort of talk about that, like what you don't release. And then my other question is more perhaps vague and philosophical, but you mentioned Isotope. And apparently today there's a new Beatles reissue and there's a new mix. And so I was wondering if, I guess for anyone, if you wanted to talk about when a work is complete, a historical work, and this idea that you can kind of revisit, and in the future when we have even more advanced AI and machine learning technology, what it means to think about these kind of archives. You mentioned about, surface noise or whatever noise from your medium. But as you mentioned, like the technology is getting good enough that you can take a 2-track tape where, the vocals aren't isolated, but a machine can figure out what the voice is. And so I wonder if you've thought about that in terms of, I guess, also related to stewarding an artist's legacy. But theoretically, you could take the original classic studio version of A Love Supreme and like, there's a couple snare hits that he misses or whatever it is, Coltrane squeaks and his son told me he always hated that squeak or, and you could fix it. So I just wonder if you could talk about either or both of those. Sorry, that was very long.
Sure. Going back to the first part, there are a lot of recordings, but most of them are live recordings. There are not a lot of studio recordings. So it usually comes down, and usually the first person to hear the recordings, I mean, there are bootlegs, but even things that people find and they want to do the right thing with them, they'll send it to the family. And most of those things just based, I mean, there are no bad John Coltrane performances that I've ever heard. So it's never about the performance. The performance is always worthy of being heard, but it is about the quality of the recording. So that's usually when we choose not to release something, is if the quality, if the audio quality isn't good. But then there's a lot of things if the band is on tour in Europe at one point, and the concerts were fairly similar in that they played the same songs, and how many versions do you need of that, even if the quality is good, that comes into it as well. And we don't want to be constantly releasing these kinds of recordings. There's not a lot of value, and the family doesn't necessarily want all those things coming out. So it's really a matter of choosing the things that sound good, where the performances are. I mean, remember, John Coltrane died at 40 years old. If you look at the amount of John Coltrane recordings, and he only really started recording as a leader 6 years before his death. It's shocking to think about. So we really want to release only the best material. Fortunately, the things that were referenced in that article are recently discovered tapes that, again, we didn't know about. We are working on getting them released, but the performances are unusual. The grouping is odd. The material is unique for this group, and the recording quality is great. So those are all kinds of things that we have to consider. We're not sitting on things that we think would be really good just to sit on them. Either the recording quality isn't good enough, or the family wants to release certain things. And I don't in terms of the technology and software. I mean, I can say definitively we will not be correcting any Elvin Jones snare hits on A Love Supreme. Yeah.
But it's true though that I think that audio always is engaged in a process of translation in the way that language is, or that a poem is, and so forth, right? So we oftentimes think of languages, say we can't read anymore, most people can't read anymore. You encounter it in translation. And so would you say that if you read a translation of a poem, you don't know what it means because you couldn't read the original language? Or, it would be you raise the Bible, would you say if you can't read the original language, you don't know what it means? The translation is this constantly moving process where they're really, even the original is not original in some sense. The original is the poets or mediation of what they were feeling at a moment. So you're always already mediated, I think. So I think the question is how to continue to translate and mediate with care, while recognizing you can't ever keep an original thing original. I think that the philosophical answer to the philosophical question.
Okay, time maybe for one more question. Yes.
Oh, sure. Anybody has one more?
Don't be bashful. Okay, if not, well, let's thank our speakers for a great exchange. I'm going to dash out and buy the Coltrane record. I guess I can go on Apple Music and buy it. So thank you, and thanks for coming out tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Herman. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if anybody wants to come up and check out an aluminum record, feel free to come and check it out.
It wasn't made into an airplane.
When we first transferred the tape, he said something like the Bible, or when we first transferred that tape, I sent a copy of it to Sonny Rollins because I thought he would really